Thank you.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Elian. Nice to see you. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Danny Woolick is here. And Malcolm Woolick is here. Michael Gross. And Shirley's arrived as well. Nice to see you, Shirley. Nice to see you. And all our other regulars. Nice to see you all here. Baruch Hashem. Henry Israel is coming online. And so it's a wonderful spot Tuesday morning to get together, to learn a little bit together. And just delve a little bit into some of the ideas in the Chumash and in Chazal that we're looking at. Just to remind you, last week we looked at a few very fascinating Ma'amorei Chazal which connected to Avraham Avinu in Parshas Vayera. And one of them was Emol Ma'at V'asei Harbeh. You remember we spoke about that the Chazal, Shammai in Pirkei Avos chapter 1 advises people that one's actions should always exceed one's promises. And this principle is learned from Avraham Avinu, who offered the guests a crust of bread and gave them a delicious meal. And this principle is a very fascinating principle, both Ben Adam L'Makom, as well as both Ben Adam L'Chaveira and Ben Adam L'Makom, as we discussed last week. We also last week looked at the difference in Iker and Tofel, different applications of the Iker and Tofel distinction. We're going to continue here, looking carefully at some of the Ma'amorei Chazal connected to the famous events at the beginning of Parshas Vayera. And as I always say in this shir, what we're looking for really in the Chumash, in Bereshis, is to see in what way the events of Sefer Bereshis really lay the foundations for the whole future of the Jewish people, of the Tanakh, of our Hashkafa, and our way of life. So Avraham Avinu engages in Chesed and becomes the paradigm of Chesed. And when we open our Shemona Esrei every day, we mention Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. We say V'zoicher Chastei Avos. In a sense, our strongest claim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that our tefillas should be heard, is Zoicher Chastei Avos. The Chesed done, and when it says Avos, of course, primarily it means Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but it also means your Zayda and your Bubba and the ancestors, our ancestors, even in extremely hard, difficult situations, even when they had very little, they always engaged in Chesed. And it's interesting, the Rambam writes in Hilchos Tzedakah, he writes, I've never seen or heard of a Jewish community that doesn't have an extensive Gemach fund and a Tzedakah fund and cares for the needy and for those who are struggling. So this became a hallmark of Klal Yisrael. So Avraham Avinu lays the foundations, the two great foundations of the hallmarks of Klal Yisrael. One is Emunah. He goes around spreading the light, teaching Emunah, and the other is Chesed. I'd like to have a look at a couple of interesting things here. Maybe I'd like to start off with seeing a little bit of a couple of lines in the writings of the Ben Ish Chai, maybe a 2-minute introduction to the Ben Ish Chai, not somebody I quote frequently, but he was one of the Gedolei Yisrael in the 19th century of the Sephardi community in Baghdad. He was the Rav of Baghdad for about 50 years. I mean, he became the Rav, he took over from his father at the age of 25. He became the Rav of Baghdad. And for 50 years, he really ruled Baghdad totally. And he became the dominant voice in a very important community in Klal Yisrael. The Iraqi community of Baghdad was one of the big, massive centers of Torah learning, of mitzvahs, of chesed. Sadly, all expelled from Iraq and destroyed. It's an interesting thing, actually, about contemporary Jewish history, that we in Ashkenaz, we are so focused on the Holocaust and the terrible trauma of the Holocaust and the horrific suffering of the Holocaust was so overwhelming that we don't often talk about what happened to the communities of the Eidot HaMizrach, communities of Baghdad and of Yemen and of Morocco and of Algeria and Tunisia, they were expelled. And when I say expelled, what that means is that they were rendered from one day to the next, they were rendered penniless immigrants. They arrived in Israel or in other places, in France, they arrived with a shirt on their back after having lived as very wealthy families for generations. And the tragedy that hit the Eidot HaMizrach, it's true, it wasn't the massacre of the Holocaust, but it was a most unbelievable travesty and cruelty of the Eidot HaMizrach communities. And if you read stories about Baghdad in the 19th century, or even in the early 20th century, it was really a phenomenally impressive and powerful Jewish community on all levels, educational levels, chesed levels, Torah levels, and extremely impressive. And the man behind it really was this HaChacham Yosef Chaim. That's what he was referred to. HaChacham Yosef Chaim wrote a book. He became famous for his Sfarim called Ben Ish Chai. The truth is, he wrote lots of other Sfarim as well. And one of his very interesting features was that he was able, in a very fascinating way, to combine Kabbalah with Halacha. And all his writings are really interwoven between Kabbalah and Halacha, and that gave all his writings a very particular flavor, that he took you into mystical areas which other poskim really didn't get involved in. As a footnote to that, it's worth mentioning that Hagar Ravadia Yosef, who I'm sure you all remember, who was in our lifetime, so Ravadia Yosef became really, in a sense, he inherited that position of being the greatest halachic and communal leader of the Eidot HaMizrach communities. But in his writings, he often takes issue with the Ben Ish Chai. He often, with the greatest respect, he disagrees with the Ben Ish Chai on the basis that the Ben Ish Chai was too machmir. And the reason why the Ben Ish Chai was too machmir is because the Ben Ish Chai was using Kabbalah in order to paskin halachic issues. So Rabbi Yosef often mentions in passing that he sees his job as restoring the halacha to its original primal position alongside with Kabbalah, but not intermingled with Kabbalah. Because the truth is, the Kabbalistic poskim were always much more machmir, or always much more severe in their Piskei Halachas, because they brought the Zohar and the Arizal into the field of halacha. Whereas in the other poskim, while regarding the Zohar and the Arizal as writings of the greatest Kedusha, kept a sort of a wall between Kabbalah on the one hand, which is inspirational and spiritual and very interesting and can bring a person to greater spiritual heights, as opposed to halacha, which is normative and applies to every man and woman in Klal Yisrael. So Ravadi Yosef tried to in some way restore that balance after the Ben Ish Chai, and by doing so, of course, he incurred the wrath of the Iraqi Rabbonim, who were staunch followers of the Ben Ish Chai. And if you read some of the writings of Rabbi Yosef, you'll find, and even some of his biography, you'll find that one of the things he had to struggle with was the opposition that he got within the Sephardi community from the Rabbonim from Iraq. There were hundreds of them who were greatly offended by the fact that Rabbi Yosef had the gall to take on the rulings of the Ben Ish Chai. But the truth is, he did, and he did so successfully, and he did the Sephardi world a big favor by doing so. Having said all that, the Ben Ish Chai, Yosef Chaim, was really a pillar of Torah and mitzvahs and halacha and Kabbalah for 50 years, basically. From the second half of the 19th century, he was really the central figure of Eidot HaMizrach Yiddishkeit, And to this day, in many of the Sephardi shuls that you'll come to, if you ever wander into one of the Eidat Mizrach shuls, many of them, as a matter of course, before they start davening Mincha or Ma'ariv in the afternoon, will sit down and read out loud a few paragraphs from the Ben Ish Chai. That became part of the canon, if you like, of the Sephardi Jewish communities in many cases. Anyway, having said all that, it's always interesting to get to know some of the people who formed and were so influential in the Jewish life that we are familiar with today. So here we'll just bring you a little bit of an interesting text here. Bear with me for 1 second. Rabbi, I just want to get the right text up here. Up here. Okay. You see the text? Yes? Good, lovely, thank you. So just to remind you, we noticed in the opening 3 psukim of Vayera, where Avram lifts up his eyes and he sees these three visitors coming, and it says here this pasuk, Vayomar, and he said, Adonai, right? Which the pshat is that he is addressing these guests, particularly it's in the singular, so he's addressing the senior of the 3 guests, and he says to them, please don't pass by without coming in to my tent for a rest, for refreshments. Please allow me to offer you hospitality. So this word, Aleph Daled Nun Yud, has here famously an ambiguity to it, right? That it could mean, as I say, the pshat is that he's addressing these guests, or it could mean, this whole pasuk could mean something else completely. It could mean that he's addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. By Yomer, he could say Adonai. He's referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he's saying, so what if he's addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what is he saying? He's saying, he's speaking to God, and he's saying, I'm currently in the middle of a prophetic experience, right? And Vayera Elov Hashem, please don't leave me, right? I'm not cutting off my connection to the Gilui Shechina, to the spiritual moment or prophetic moment that I'm having. I'm just putting it on hold in order to deal with these guests. So he's saying, I want you to see the beauty of this. This is a pasuk which can be read on 2 completely different levels, these words, right? So according to a different meaning, it means, he says to God, if I found favor in your eyes, meaning in God's eyes, don't leave me. Please just allow me to take a break and deal with these guests, and later on, after they've gone, to continue my spiritual prophetic moment. So we looked at the Gemara here, where the Gemara says, right. So this is the Gemara which we started looking at, right? Where Rabbi Yehuda Marav said in the Gemara on Shabbos, it says we can see from here that Gedola Achnosas Orchim Mekabolas Pnei Ashchina, that the mitzvah of receiving guests is greater than the moment, the prophetic moment of Avraham Avinu. How do we know that? Because the pasuk says, so you can see the Gemara here is adopting not the pshat, not the pshat that he's addressing the guests, but the, if you like, the drush that he is addressing HaKadosh Baruch. So have a look at this. The Gemara continues here, and the Gemara continues and says, Omar Rabbi Elazar, Boyura'ei, come and see. Now, this is a very interesting phrase, this word come and see. We'll see in a minute. Come and see. Shalom midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu midas basar v'dam. How HaKadosh Baruch Hu's standards of behavior are different to those among people. Midas basar v'dam, when you're dealing with interhuman activities, ein kotan yochel lomar agadol hamtein achava elech. A junior person will not say to a senior person, just wait for me for a little while and I'll get back to you. That's not the ilu b'HaKadosh Baruch Hu k'siv vayom Hashem no matzasi. So in other words, Rabbi Loza here is saying that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is happy for Avraham Avinu to say to God, please wait for me while I'm doing something else, right? And the idea here is, and the Gemara says, boy ura'eh. So the Ben Ish Chai, in his commentary on this piece of Gemara, is interested in this word boy ura'eh. Come and see how HaKadosh Baruch Hu tolerates, not only tolerates, but even praises Abraham for engaging in chesed, even though he's in the middle of a prophetic experience. Right? And it's not so obvious, and that's right. If you remember, I told you the story of the Chabad in Venice, right? The Chabad people who interrupted davening in order to look after these passing Chiloni tourists, right? And I brought that as one of the examples in my life of people who were acting out this particular principle, that even though they were in the middle of davening, there was something urgent ben Adam lachaveiro, which if they would have delayed it, they would have missed it. It was a mitzvah iveris. It was something which would have been missed. And similarly, Avraham Avinu understood that if he said to these guests, hang on for half an hour, they would simply have passed him by. So he was able to put his nevuah on hold in order to welcome these guests. I'm interested here. I just picked up a very interesting few lines from the Ben Ish Chai. So let's have a look at this together. This is in a sefer called the Ben Yehoyada, written by the Ben Ish Chai. So he says, Bo Ra'esh, no committers HaKadosh Baruch Hu midas basar v'dam. Kosher, right? So he starts off with the word kosher. I had a question. Omro Bo, why do Chazal say come and see? Lahechan Yovan, come to where? Me'eze Mokom Yotza. Where are you coming from? Right. So he's actually having he's having a closer look at the language of Chazal. Why would Chazal say Bo Ura'eh? He says Me'eze Mokom Yotza. Where is he coming out from? V'nira li b'siyata d'shmaya. And it seems to me, he says, this is the Ben Ish Chai, the b'Torah yesh daled chalakim. Whenever you're learning Torah, you have to learn it on 4 different levels, right? And the famous acrostic for that is Pardes, right? This is the Pardes in brackets, which means Pshat, Remez, Derush, and Sod. Whenever you're learning Chumash, you've got to be aware of the fact that there are, and this is one of the immense beauties of Torah learning, that there are layers upon layers of meaning, and these layers of meaning don't contradict each other. They are all simultaneously true. They're just different ways of looking at the same idea, different perspectives, right? In mathematics, there's only one answer. There aren't layers of truth. There's one answer. But in Torah, there are layers upon layers of meaning and truth, symbolic truth, mystical truth, practical. All these things are all compacted into the few words of the Torah. It says, here we are, we're learning Vayera, says the Ben Ish Chai. We're learning Vayera together, and we have to look at it, Pshat, Remez, Derush, and Sod. So the Pshat is what we would call the translation, right? The Remez is the symbolism. There's something here which is symbolic. The Derush is ideas that Chazal extracted from the Pasuk, which are not in the Pasuk at all, but they are by association. And the Sod is already, the word Sod is already dealing with the Kabbalistic and deeper meaning of the Torah. So he says, Kafi. So he says, Ukafi chelek hapshat. If you learn this pasuk according to level 1, which is pshat, there is no proof that HaKadosh Baruch Hu waited for Avraham. The Kafi Abshat, Hamikra Yisparish, Adonai Nomatzosi Benecha Hu Shem Chol. According to Pshat, the word Adonai is a Shem Chol. You can see he says the word Chol here, Chol meaning as opposed to Kodesh, right? Lahavdil ben Kodesh L'Chol. The name Adonai, according to the Pshat, is not a name which has sanctity to it, because it's simply like in Ivrit nowadays, you'd say the word Adoni. Adoni just means sir. It's just a polite, respectful way to address another person, right? Ukamo. That he was addressing the senior one. He says, look at this. Very interesting. He says, B'chelek hadrasha shedoshin the kodesh. Once you move from the pshat into the drush, Chazal understood that there was another layer of meaning here, which was equally true. In other words, he was also addressing the guests. At the same time, he was addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Incidentally, we find this a few times in Chazal, right? That, for example, Esther HaMalka comes to Achashverosh, and she says, "Im no motzosi chen be'inei hamelech, v'im halamelech toiv." Right. So the pshat is she's talking to Achashverosh, but Chazal say that in her heart she was actually talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. She was addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Im motzosi chen be'inei hamelech, v'im halamelech toiv. That the melech is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And actually, if you go with the Medrash, you go through Megillas Esther, understanding that the melech often refers to a conversation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You understand that Chazal saw that these great individuals, people like Avraham Avinu and Esther Malka, had the ability to engage in interhuman conversations, while at the same time, at a different level, their mind and their neshama was focused on their conversation with God. So both are true at the same time. He was addressing the guests, but he was also addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he says the Ben Ish Chai, b'chelek hadrasha, dorshin shem ze kodesh. According to the drush, the name Adonai is name of God. Ulakadosh Baruch Hu Yomekein. We're speaking to God. Ulazeh Omar, and if you understand that, it says Boyurei. Come and see something beautiful. That according to this deeper level, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is willing to wait for Avraham while he engages in Chesed. Right? But look what he says here. Ritzono Loma. So the way to learn this Chazal is say mechelek hapshat uboy lechelek hadrash. The tzei and the boy, which means go out and come in, which usually refers to physical activities of entering and exiting, is here speaking about entering and exiting layers of meaning. He says, can't say, leave behind the first level of simple pshat, and uboy l'chelek hadrash. So whenever the Gemara says boy urei, we find this actually, I must tell you, in our Haggadah. Next time that you're saying the Haggadah at Leil Seder, and you come to the part of the Haggadah which says say ulmad, ma bikesh lovan ha'arami, right? That part of the Haggadah of Leil Seder, which starts with the word say ulmad, the word say, what does it mean? What is say ulmad? Say from where? Say means go out and see. Go out where? From where? Where are we going out from? Why doesn't it just say come and listen, right? But what is the tzei ulmad? So the Ben Ish Chai will tell you, whenever it says tzei ulmad, or wherever it says boy urei, it means we're leaving behind the simple interpretation and we are entering deeper levels of meaning. I just find this very, very fascinating, right? Say mechelek hapshat. You can see the words I've highlighted on the screen. Ritzono loma say mechelek hapshat. Leave behind the pshat. Yes. Because on a simple level, in the Haggadah, if we look at the Haggadah for a minute, Arami Oved Ovi, Vayerin Mitzrayma, Vayogo Shambim Seima'ot, has got no, the Arami Oved Ovi is not referring to Lavan, according to the Pshat in the Pasuk, right? According to the Drush, the Arami is Lavan, Ma Bikesh Lavan or Arami, what did the Arami Lavan want to do? According to the simple meaning, right? Arami Obedov is a reference to Avraham Avinu, who came from Aram Naharayim, that he was a wandering Jew. That's the Pshat. But Seil Mad means let's leave behind the Pshat and let's drill deeper into the meaning of the Torah and reveal another level of meaning, which is the meaning of the meaning of the drush. Incidentally, in Parshas Devarim, right, in last week's Parsha that we read, there's something very fascinating that it says Moshe Rabbeinu, there's something very fascinating at the beginning of the book of Devarim. So I want you to imagine Moshe and Aaron have been with the Jewish people for 40 years in the Midbar. What have they been doing for 40 years? They didn't need to earn a parnasa, right? They were eating man. They didn't need to fight any battles. They were defended by the Ananei HaKavod. Right? What were they doing when they got up on a Tuesday morning? They went on Zoom. And what did they do on a Tuesday morning? At 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, they went on Zoom. And what did they do? They had a Torah share from Moshe and Aaron every morning, 7 days a week. They were learning Torah from Moshe and Aaron all the time. Moshe was doing, what was he doing for 40 years, right? He was teaching them Torah. He was explaining to them the principles of Torah. They were teaching each other. They had it was the biggest kollel in Jewish history, right? The whole of Klal Yisrael was sitting and learning Torah for 40 years. There was nothing else. There was literally nothing else for them to do in the Midbar. They had no interaction with any other nations. There weren't any libraries to go to. There weren't any other nations to deal with. They had nothing else to do. They weren't plowing and sowing the land. They weren't building houses. They were living in tents, right? What were they doing for 40 years? And yet, look at this, in the opening psukim of Sefer Devarim, and remember that Sefer Devarim is the last 5 weeks of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, right? In fact, I'll tell you a nice gematria of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. He says, Eile hadvarim asher diber Moshe. Eile, he says, is a gematria of 36, right? The Lamed is 30, the Aleph is 1, and the Hey is 5, altogether 36. Why 36, says the Orach Chaim HaKadosh? Because these were the last 36 days of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. Moshe Rabbeinu, because the Pasuk says, he started on Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and he died on the 7th of Adar. So there are 36 days. The last 36 days of Moshe Rabbeinu's life is Eile HaDvarim. So the whole book of Devarim, right, was written, was said by Moshe Rabbeinu in 36 days. But what does it say at the beginning of Devarim? It says, in opening, it says, Be'eva HaYarden Ho'il Moshe Be'er Es HaTorah Hazeh. Says Rashi, what does it mean, Ho'il? Ho'il means he started. But Moshe Rabbeinu started, Be'er, Beis Aleph Reish, comes from the word Bi'ur, Leva'er, right? Bi'urim, mean explanations. He started to explain the Torah. So you ask yourself a question, wait a minute, what do you mean he started to explain the Torah? He's been doing that for 40 years. It's the last month of his life. What does it mean now he started to explain the Torah? What is he starting to do now that he hasn't been doing for 40 years? So Rashi says something extraordinary. Rashi says, B'shivim Loshen. Rashi says, Be'er means B'shivim Loshen, right? In 70 languages. But the Vilna Gaon already remarks on the fact that clearly it doesn't mean, when Chazal say 70 languages, it doesn't mean that Moshe Rabbeinu started teaching the Torah in Greek and in Persian and in English and in French and in Hindi, and it doesn't mean that. Why would he do that? It's a waste of time. Nobody understood these languages. Why would Moshe Rabbeinu make this into a multilingual experience of teaching Torah in different languages? So the Vilna Gaon says, no, Shivim Lashonas doesn't mean 70 languages. It means 70 expressions. Lashon Chazal means a way of understanding something. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu started teaching them Shivim Ponim La Torah, the 70 layers of Torah. He started giving them deeper and deeper insights into, now to a certain extent until now, he had been teaching them the Pshat, he'd been teaching them the Torah to memorize it, to understand it, what's the halacha, what is Shabbos, what is Kashrus, what is Yom Kippur, what is Bris Milah. All this was completely new to Klal Yisrael, right? He had to teach them Torah, every word of it. But now he started to teach them B'shivim Lashonas, meaning the deeper levels, the deeper meanings of the same words and the same ideas have levels upon levels and layers upon layers of meaning. And that's part of the really fabulous parts of Torah. That you can, I remember once I was sitting in my house many years ago in London, and I was learning Chumash, and one of my grandchildren, small kids, sort of a 6 or 7 year old, asked me, Saba, what are you learning? I said, I'm learning Chumash. He said, what are you learning? What are you learning? I said, I'm learning Noach, Parshas Noach. So he says, we're already doing Lech Lecha. That's what he says. You're still stuck on Parshas Noach. We're already up to Lech Lecha. And I was struck by the fact that, here's this kid learning Chumash. He understands it at his level. He's already done Noach, right? He's done Noach. Why is his Saba still learning Noach? You don't believe that, right? And the answer is that every time you learn it again, you see a different layer of meaning. You see deeper understanding. You understand it at a deeper level, right? The little kid thought, okay, you read it once, it does it, right? That is the most incredible difference between learning Torah and reading any other book. Other books, you read them once, you've read the book, and that's it, right? But the Torah has got Shivim Lash, 70 worlds, layers, layer upon layer. If you go deeper and deeper into it, you get into Pshat type. Even within Pshat, there are several layers. And in Drush, there are lots of different layers. And in Remez and inside Pshat, the Parades are 4 different categories, really. But in these 4 different categories, there are Shivim L'Shemus. There are 70 different ways of understanding and explaining Torah. And that's part of the incredible beauty of the Torah. And in these shiurim, I try and give you a little bit of a taste of that depth of the learning. So here you have a very interesting, you have a seemingly simple posuk. Avram is saying to the guests, please don't pass by, please come in for refreshments. Say Chazal, yes, he was speaking to them, but on a different layer of meaning. And this means, of course, for Avraham Avinu, on a different layer of his own neshama, he was speaking to God. And he was saying, please don't leave me. I have to now go and do something else. Don't leave me behind. I want to continue this nevuah after these malachim have gone. And in actual fact, when the malachim go, it says, Avram shovlim kaimoi. Avram returned to the place where he was at. Right? Which is a very fascinating thing, because you understand also that in the Torah, the word makom also has ambiguities to it. Right? Hamakom is a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? When we say to an Ovel, Chas v'Shalom, Hamakom Yenachem Eschem, it's a reference to God, right? Hamakom, so when it says that Avram Shovlim Kaima, that he went back to his place, doesn't mean he went back home again and sat in his chair. It means he was able to return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and pick up where he left off. Right? And that was a tremendous ability of Avraham Avinu, but it only makes sense if you understand that Avraham, the different layers of meaning. Incidentally, I want to tell you, just as a footnote here, a very interesting story about Elie Wiesel. Many of you have heard of Elie Wiesel, one of the most poetic and powerful sort of spokesperson for the Holocaust, who himself went through concentration camps, came out of Hungary, went through concentration camps, lost his family, and his life's work was to make sure that the next generation remembered the Holocaust. So he was once giving a talk in Oxford University in the Postgraduate Center for Jewish Studies in Oxford University. Some of you might know of it. Now, the truth is, the Oxford Postgraduate Center for Jewish Studies is not an orthodox organization, far from it. And in actual fact, most of the students there are not even Jewish. That's a different story completely, but they're studying ancient texts and they have a Jewish flavor. And they invited Elie Wiesel to come and give a talk. And in his talk, he said something which left his audience bewildered a little bit. But it was reported later on, and I understood it completely. Listen to this, what he said. So Elie Wiesel said, I want to ask you a question, he said to his audience. What do you think was the first thing I wanted to do when I was liberated from the concentration camp? Imagine the suffering, the starvation, the dirt, the filth, everything. What was the first thing in my mind, what I really, really wanted to do more than anything else when I left the concentration camps, when I was liberated? What did I want to do? So you think, well, have a good meal, have a good shower, whatever, one thing, another. He says, but what was in my mind, and I couldn't get it out of my head, was as follows. He said that as a young man, as a kid, before we went into the camps, I was very, very close to my grandfather. And every day I would sit and learn Gemara with my grandfather. Right? Every day, and that was my relationship with my grandfather, and I would learn Gemara with my grandfather for hours, and that was the thing I loved more than anything else. When we came into the concentration camps, sadly, my grandfather was taken away from me, and I never saw him again. And from that moment on in my mind, what I was focusing on was, when I get out of this, I need to find a Gemara, and I need to pick up where we left off. I remember exactly the page and the line of Gemara where I finished learning with my grandfather, and I want to pick up where I left off. That's what I want to do. And the person who told me this story said 90% of the audience listened to this story with some bewilderment. Many of them are studying Talmudic texts of one sort or another, but the idea that should be such an important thing in his life. But you see, the point is, these people weren't actually studying Torah; they were just studying Talmudic texts. If you're studying Torah and you understand the beauty of the Kedusha of Torah, so for him, that learning with his grandfather was his connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, his connection to Am Yisrael, and he wanted to pick up where he left off. Right? There is and that gave him a sense that life continued, that he hadn't completely lost his earlier life. It's a beautiful story, that. I don't know if I've managed to put it over in its full glory, but I think that story is very profound. That's what he wanted more than anything else. He wanted to make sure that kesher that he had with his grandfather was still alive and well. He said, as soon as I got to France, I got somebody to get me this Gemara, and I sat down and I started learning at the line of Gemara where I finished with my grandfather, just to continue, right, to make sure that continued. Why do I mention this? It's just really by association, but in Parshas Vayera, Avraham Avinu also goes through this whole event with the three Malachim and all the aspects of it and all the issues connected to it with Sarah and with the prediction of Yitzchak and whatever it is. And in the end, Avraham Shovlim Kaiman, he picks up where he left off. He went back to his state where he was adding the opening words of Parshas Vayera Elov Hashem Be'elonei Mamre. He was in the middle of his nevuah. Anyhow, we were looking at these few lines in the Ben Ish Chai, right? So I just thought it was very beautiful that Chazal said, Boy Urei. You can see I've highlighted the word boy. Chazal said, Boy Urei, come and see it. So he said the words of Chazal are not random. Boy Urei is not just a poetic phrase. Boy Urei means come, meaning he says, what does it mean? It says, say mechelek hapshat uboy lechelek hadrash. Leave behind the simple meaning and dive into the drush and understand that he's speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and only then, says the Ben Ish Chai, va'oz tireh, and then you will see Shalom Kemidas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Midas Basar Adam, how the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu behaves with us is many, many more times more gracious and generous and forgiving than we behave with each other. In other words, if we were behaving with each other, we wouldn't be happy to see a junior person telling a senior person, just sit here and wait for me while I'm doing something else and I'll get back to you. We wouldn't be happy to see that. It would be a breach of covet. But with our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's not like that. And the reason why it's not like that is, says the Hamek Dava, is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to engage it. When we're engaging in chesed, that in itself is another way of relating to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That in some sense, even having a prophetic vision is one way of connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but that's not why God created man. He created man in order to engage in mitzvahs and to create, and chesed being a primary mitzvah. That's what he wanted to see. And the chesed itself is of the greatest significance. Okay, let's move on here a little bit. There's another very interesting detail here with Sarah Imenu. Second. Right. So at a certain point, the Malachim have come. Part of the job of the Malachim was to tell Sarah about the imminent birth of Yitzchak. So they said, "Vayomer Elav, Aye Sarah Ishtecha." You can see the text I've highlighted here. And the guest said to Avraham Avinu, "Where is Sarah?" Vayomer, and he said, "Hine ba'ohel." She is in the tent, right? But being in the tent doesn't mean that she's completely disconnected from this event, because the pasuk says, "Vayomer shov ushuv elecha k'eis chaya," we will return to you in a year's time. V'hinei ben l'Sara ishtecha, and by that time Sarah will give birth to Yitzchak. And look what the pasuk here says, something very interesting. Look, Rabbi say, the Sarah sheimas Pesach ohel v'hu acharav. It's true that she's in the ohel, but she is. What is she doing? She's Pesach ohel. She's at the entrance to the tent, and what is she doing? The Sarah sheimas. Sarah is listening, and here's a very interesting thing. Sarah is listening, right? In other words, she's not. On the one hand, she's modest. She's not sitting at the table with the other male guests as the only female. That was in that context was inappropriate, but she's involved. I just want to mention something interesting about where else, incidentally, does anybody have a suggestion? Where else in Sefer Bereshis is there an example of a mother who is not present, but she hears what's going on? And you find the word shoma'as appears somewhere else. Anybody know? Any offers?
Rivka.
Hey, very good. Who said that? Danny.
Yeah.
Very good. But Rivka Shoma'as, where's that mentioned, Danny? What context?
I think that Yitzchak wanted to give the bracha to Esau.
That's right. The beginning of Parshas told us Yitzchak wishes to give the bracha to Esau. And he says to Esau, go out hunting, bring me some food, and then I'll give you the bracha. And then it says, V'Rivka Shoma'as. Rivka wasn't present, but she hears what's going on. And because she hears what's going on, she devises this whole plan that Yaakov should impersonate Esau, go in and take the brachas instead. So here you have Sarah Shoma'as and Rivka Shoma'as. And why is it important? First of all, it's important to understand the word lishmoa. The word lishmoa, shema, shin mem ayin, which brings us actually to this week's Parsha Shavua, right? Parshas Bois Hanan is, among other things, famous for being the Parsha of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Those 6 words, arguably the most famous pasuk in the entire Torah, in a certain sense, right? That single word. But actually, what does it mean, Shema? What are we being told? What is Moshe Rabbeinu telling us when he gives us this instruction, Shema, right? So it's important to understand in biblical Hebrew that the word lishmoa doesn't mean to hear something. Doesn't mean to hear. Hearing is something a baby does from the first day, and we're all hearing things all the time. It's not a big deal to hear something. Hearing is just having an audio experience, which every human being has every waking moment of his life. So what is Shema Yisrael? What is this special hearing? So the truth is, in English as well, we have an interesting difference between the word to hear and the word to listen. Listen is different to hear. And one could even say that to hear is a passive activity. You're sitting here and you're hearing. You can't help hearing, right? Your ears are working and the sound waves are coming and you're hearing something. But listening to it, listening is something else completely. Listening means is active. It's not passive. To listen means to understand it, to put it in context, to understand its implications, to understand what role it plays in your life. Rivka Shoma'as doesn't just mean she overheard the conversation. It means she understood what Yitzchak had intended to do with Esav, and she understood that was a mistake, and she understood that this was calling upon her to act in order to make sure that Yaakov got the brachas instead of Esav. All this is in the word Rivka Shoma'as. Rivka Shoma'as, she heard it, but she didn't just hear it, right? In Yiddish, there's a difference between Aaron and Daheren. Daher, to daher something is different to hearing, right? Hearing means to listen, to hear, but to daher means to understand, to listen and to understand the implications of something.
Pay attention.
To pay attention, yes, to pay attention. And in actual fact, somebody showed me once, I remember a few years ago, just remember this, that in the Koren Siddur, which has an English translation, which was put together by the late Jonathan Sachs, right? So when it comes to Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, he doesn't write, "Hear, O Israel." He writes, "Listen." He translates Shema as "listen, Israel." So listen means to hear and to understand its implications, to understand its meaning and its depth. And that's what Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Listen to the principle of Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which is really the principle of emunah. That this pasuk in 6 words sums up what we call our emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what Chazal call Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shamayim, to accept upon oneself the Malchus Shamayim, the power and the existence of God, the Creator. But in other words, the Shema is a Kabbalah, right? So in other words, when similarly, another application of this is when Klal Yisrael at Har Sinai said Naaseh v'nishma. They didn't say we're going to do it and we're going to hear it. Right? You can't do it unless you hear it. Because we're going to do it and we're going to listen to it. We're going to delve into it. We're going to understand its meaning and its application. So the word lishmoya is actually means something completely different to what we normally think that to hear means, right? In actual fact, in the Birkas, in the part of the bracha just before Kriyas Shema, when we daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ahava Rabba, and we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, B'sein v'libeinu, we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to give us the ability to learn Torah properly, and we use 8 different verbs, one after another, right? B'sein v'libeinu, lahavin, or lahaskil, lishmoya, lilmod, or lamed, lishma, v'lasos, or lakayim. These are 8 different words that we use, 8 verbs, right? But it's interesting, lahovin or lahaskil, we understand, is to delve into something deeply. And then we say lahovin or lahaskil, lishma. Lishma is number 3. How can lishma be number 3? Lishma should be number 1. If it just means to hear something, it has to be number 1. Because lishma means to really daher, to really understand the implications the meaning and the origin and the application of something. That is lishmoya at the deepest level possible, and that's what we daven for. The hovin or lahaskil lishmoya is a type of bina and seichel, and that is another application. So we have naseh and nishma, we have lishmoa, and when it says so, the Sarah shomas, it means that Sarah didn't just hear that they had given a prediction of the birth of a baby son. She understood that this prediction was a game changer. It would change her life, Avram's life, was the moment she'd been waiting for, right? She's now 90 years old, right? She's now 89. She gives birth at the age of 90, the Pasuk says, right? So she's now 89 years old. So for her whole adult life, she's been waiting for this moment. She's waiting for this moment when she's going to hear a nevuah, a prophetic statement that in a year's time you're going to have a baby son. That for her was something which was something shomas, is got a much deeper meaning to it. The sorrow shebas, right? That she hears what's going on and she understands and she listens, right? And I have a feeling there are many Jewish wives and mothers who are in the house very often, and they overhear other conversations going on in the house, and they understand exactly what's happening and what's going on, right? Even though they're not sitting at the table, they know, right? This is a masera from Sarah and from Rivka, that the job of a woman in the house is maybe not to be frontline present, but to understand what's going on and to be involved in what's going on. But Sarah Shamas, she heard it. This is part of the beauty of this particular pasuk. Bear with me for 1 minute, ladies and gentlemen. There was something else here I wanted to have a look at. Okay, I just want to. So so in this year we're trying to have a look at the implications of Sefer Bereshis for later generations. Here's another very interesting example of this from the Gemara in Bava Metzia Pevov. So there it says, I've highlighted the text on the screen. The Ober of Chama Rab Chanina, V'chein Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael. I'll say in the name of the Tana Rabbi Yishmael, B'schar Shalosha Zochu L'Shlosha. Right, these 4 words. Right? B'schar Shalosha, in a reward for 3 things. B'schar Shalosha Zochu, the Jewish people merited L'Shlosha. They merited 3 things in the future. So what are Chazal doing here? Again, they're doing what I mentioned to you all the time. They're saying this story of Avraham Avinu and the Malachim lays the foundations for future events. What future events are we talking about? So look at the way the Gemara spells it out. B'schar chemo v'cholov, as a reward for Avraham Avinu giving the Malachim chemo v'cholov, zachu lemon. They were zeicher, they had the merit afterwards to receive from HaKadosh Baruch Hu for 40 years the mon in the middle. B'schav hu omeid aleihem zachu la'amud ha'ana. Because it says v'hu omeid aleihem tachas ha'eit, he's looking over them and watching over them and guarding them and paying attention to them. In that zechus we got ba'amud ha'ana. B'schar yukach no ma'at mayim in a reward for Avram Avinu saying Yukach no ma'at mayim, they received later on the Be'er Shamaria. So what's this Gemara doing? The Gemara is looking at events that took place in the 40 years in the Midbar and the 3 famous great gifts that we received in order to survive in the desert was the Mon, the Be'er, and the Ananei covered. Says the Gemara here, name of Rabbi Yishmael, that Chazal, that Klal Yisrael received these gifts from HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a reward for Avram's chesed. Again, it brings new meaning. If you think about this piece of Gemara for a minute, it brings new meanings. What we say in the morning in our davening, b'zeicher chaste avos, right? We say Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, Poel HaGodel HaGibor HaNereh, Gomer Chasod Yitzchak, b'zeicher chaste avos. That he remembers the chesed of the avos, and because of their chesed, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is able to give us later on certain gifts. So what we're doing here, what the Gemara here is doing is in some way saying that the whole miraculous existence of the Jewish people in the desert for 40 years was enabled by the chesed of Avraham Avinu. His chesed was later on in some way benefited Klal Yisrael. There's actually an interesting discussion surrounding this Gemara, because there is another Gemara in Tainis Taftes which says that the Mon was in the Zechus of Moshe, and the Aron covered in the Zechus of Aaron, and the Be'er in the Zechus of Miriam. So it seems to be a contradiction. So what was it? Was it Avram, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, or was it Avram's Chesed? So this is a question. The Marsha asks this question. The Torah Tamima, many of the Mefarshim ask this question, which seems to be something of a contradiction. Again, on a simple level, you can simply say these were different voices in Chazal. That according to Rabbi Yishmael, it was one way, and according to the other Gemara, it could be these are different interpretations. But actually, I saw something very beautiful in the Torah Tamima. He writes, the Torah Tamima writes something very beautiful. He says, no, both of these Gemaras are saying the same thing. Clearly, that generation received the Mon, the Be'er, and Aneh covered in the Zechus of Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. But it was in the Zechus of the Chesed of Avraham Avinu that Klal Yisrael was Zeicher to have leaders like Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. In other words, one needs a Zechus. In order to have children who can do great things, there has to be some Zechus of us, somewhere along the line. There has to be Zechus of us. There has to be the Chesed of earlier generations. That by engaging particularly in Chesed, earlier generations sow seeds which surface later on in the form of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and that's what the Torah Tamima says very beautifully. And because Avraham Avinu engaged in Chesed, he was zeicher to have descendants like Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, and through them, the Mon, the Be'er, and the Aneh HaKavod came to protect Klal Yisrael. So there you have it, Rabbi said. There you have the share for today. A few little insights into a few lines of psukim, and we're trying to delve a little bit from the pshat into the remez, the derush, and the say, different layers of meaning, and get an appreciation of these of the way in which there are shivim lashonos. There are 70 facets, like a precious diamond can be looked at from all different angles, and each different angle you can see a different light. Similarly, divrei Torah, you can look at them from different points of view, and the light reflects out of them in different ways. And that's the shivim lashonos, the 70 languages. Okay, that's it for today. And it's always great to see you guys, see everybody here. And please we're taking a short break from this shir for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, and we're back. Today's the 9th, I think. We're back on the 30th. So I'm giving you a 3-week break, ladies and gentlemen.